This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it's time for Brief Belief. And I want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in and streaming Brief Belief. Sometimes we don't want to even talk about grief, but there are other times when it's really, really important. And today's session is going to be led by Carol. And I didn't realize this, but I'm looking at your background, and you are now an end-of-life doula.
I'm a certified end-of-life doula.
I knew you were taking the classes, so congratulations on that.
Yes.
Kudos. It's much needed.
Thank you. I got my certificate several months ago, so thank you. I appreciate you noticing that.
So how are you going to lead us today? What are we going to talk about?
What I'd like to do is a little bit of a recap on what we've done, and then have each one of us interact and answer a couple of questions based on where we were and where we are today, because it's a continual growth. I'd like to start it with a quote that I just read in a book recently, and it goes like this: "Heroes don't leap tall buildings or stop bullets with an outstretched hand. They don't wear boots or capes. They bleed and they bruise. And their superpowers are as simple as listening or loving or caring. Heroes are ordinary people who know that even if their own lives are impossibly knotted, that they can help untangle someone else's. And maybe that one act can lead someone to rescue you right back." And I liked that because in my wildest dreams, I didn't realize where I would be today on my journey and how I got here and what I went through and how thankful I am for those that helped me through it. And as we know, grief is very personal and individual, and every person experiences the nuances differently. Your personality, your support system, your natural coping mechanisms, and many other things will determine how loss will affect you. There are no rules, there are no timelines, there's no linear progression. Some people feel better after a few days, some people a few months, some people years. And in the midst of learning to cope, there may be setbacks, and we all understand those setbacks. These are non-linear process that cannot be controlled. It's critical that you treat yourself with patience, compassion, and allow the process to unfold. There is no way to rush it. It is all internal and how your body processes it. Try to be kind to yourself. And there are typical good, I can talk today, of grief. While extensive and diverse, they fall into four broad categories. You have your physical, your emotional, your behavioral, and your spiritual. For instance, grief can present itself with physical symptoms. You can have the headaches, the joint pains, the nausea, the fatigue, the tension. Emotional grief might cause you to have anger, or in some cases, relief. There are behavioral manifestations of grief that include difficulty in making decisions, and I know I experienced that. And maintaining one's interest in daily activities. And again, that was one that I experienced to great depth. And the other one, the spiritual one, I'm not going to go into with us. I think that's very individualized, but the others I think we can discuss. And so what I'd like to do, as we go through the different stages of grief, to ask you a couple of questions of how you feel you reacted and how you feel where you are today. I think it may be helpful to our listeners that are early on in the process in knowing that they too will learn to cope and grow and live again. So Karen, I'll start with you because you're at the top of my screen.
Okay.
How did it feel to reflect on your way of grieving? How do you feel about how you've been grieving?
Sure. So my grieving was not for the loss of death. When I went through my grieving process, it actually turned out to be my ex-husband, because I grieved the years that I thought I had lost, messed up, and I've been carrying it with me for over 40 years. What I've been learning through all of you, and plus going through the grief recovery method, is all the angst I had been feeling. More I talked about it, more I let it come out, the stronger I felt. You know, there's still sadness. There's still things that can make me cry after all these years. But I didn't realize how much talking about it was going to help me move forward. And I actually let my ex-husband know that I went through it. And I told
What was
him
his reaction to it?
he was so glad just to have a conversation with me, that I'm not blaming him. He's not blaming me. We're not talking about our son, just talking about, I thanked him. I said, I release you from anything you may have felt, because I realized the two of us were never in love. It just happened. And for it to take over 40 years and know that there was something clawing at me. So to anybody who's out there, I think when you're ready to open up, that's what you need to do, even if it's privately. Because some of the things I learned with Christy, I have been doing on my own, getting through other scenarios. And let me tell you, I'm finding happiness where I thought there was a lot of anger.
Have you found that going through bereavement, your own bereavement, it becomes a self-reflection, and one that you assess and reassess as you're going through it, and make determinations on how you want to move forward, how best for you to move forward? Not that it's easy, not that it's not painful, but look at the growth that you've done and the freedom that you've allowed yourself by reaching out to your ex-husband, and where you are today.
You know, I always used to say that I wear my heart on my sleeve and everybody knows my story. But there's so much of my story that I haven't shared. And now that I have started to, and I've been journaling about it and sharing it in other podcasts, it's like, I think we talked about this in our other group, Candace, about the backpack. I had so many bricks in that backpack that when I would think about certain things, it just got heavier and heavier, and I couldn't sit up straight. But now it's light, and I at least have some tools for the future, because we never know when grief is going to hit us.
No. Shape or form.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Allison, same question.
Yeah, as I reflect on grief, there are all kinds of different grief events. So there's the death of my husband, and then at the moment going through and sort of developed a whole lot of ways to move forward through my grief after he died. And now I take care of his mom, who's 100. And I have caregiver grief. So 2 days ago, she called me 6 times between 11 and about 12:30. And she said she was locked in a cabin on a ship. She couldn't get out. And she couldn't reach me, even though she was leaving a message on my phone. She didn't remember my number, even though it's taped to the back of the chair behind her phone. And that's grief. That's grief. Then I went to her house the next morning. Turned out that she had gone downstairs to the doorman 3 times and he had brought her upstairs 3 times. And I called her. I talked to her for an hour and a half. And she didn't know me. Today she knew me. But she didn't know me on Sunday. Or was it Monday? She didn't know me Monday. And I'm showing her pictures of me with her son who died. This is me. This is me. And so I have all the tools from after my husband's death. And I'm needing to develop new and different tools to move through this grief. So it just underlines for me all the various kinds of grief events that we have in life that everybody goes through. And realizing that I know and the audience can know that you are not alone.
Thank you. Thank you. Candace?
So I was going to say, repeat the question, please, but this is my reflection on my experience of grief.
Yes.
Okay. So the acute experience was very painful. I suffered hugely. I had to suck it up and not show that I was suffering. Just in my job, I handle these kinds of matters for people every day. And one, I probably expected more than I realized I had the ability to cope with. I didn't ask for help. I just, kept working. That was always my way to sublimate uncomfortable feelings. The sad part is my job requires a lot of mental activity and my brain was mush. And I could look at a calculator and punch numbers in, but I couldn't make sense of the numbers. And that was a really frightening experience and it was prolonged. And then eventually I stumbled upon, the grief recovery method, which was the beginning of my way out. And I loved your quote, but one that really spoke to me was Robert Anderson's, and I had shared it before, but I'd like to repeat it because this is what I experienced, my reflecting, and it's okay that I feel like I've been spiraling up. And that's what I notice with many of the people I deal with. So he said I Never Sang for My Father, death ends a life, but not a relationship. But it does not end a relationship, which struggles on in the survivor's mind towards some final resolution, some clear meaning, which it perhaps will never find. And I don't know why that resonates for me. And it's okay that I'll never find that resolution. I heard, Reeves talk to Steve Colbert and after his girlfriend had died. And Colbert said to him, what do you think about death? And said, I think the people you leave behind will miss you. And so I don't know if Stephen was getting into some kind of, esoteric afterlife conversation and so on, but I didn't have time for any of that philosophical stuff. I had to get work done. I had to support myself. I had to do all those practical things. So I came out of that fog. It took me a long time to do it. And so my reflection is, and that's okay. Right? It wasn't okay then. I was feeling really bad. I shared my story previously, but others around me, like, you're not over it yet. But, I got past that. I'm not holding any grudges about that. I mean, that would be foolish. I was self-conscious that I couldn't get it together sooner, but I had to maintain that facade the whole time. So I guess my reflection is grace and acceptance.
Yeah. Very beautiful. Well stated. And like all of you, my grief, my reflection upon the grief that I've gone through is that as painful as it was, which each new one I was experiencing, I learned so much. And from it, I was able to carry it to the next person that I was losing. I regret with my mother-in-law, because she was the first one I lost, that I didn't have a greater depth of understanding and how to deal with her. I tried the best I could, and I know that I did the best that I could, but I learned so much from her. And I'm so grateful that we had that time together and helped me grow so I could be there for my father, for my mother, and for my husband. And with each one of them, as painful as it was, the death of my husband was the most traumatic for me. But I had so many tools, and I was able to keep him comfortable, and I was able to communicate with him, and I was able to be there for the children and our friends because of what I had already been through. What I found I was doing is that I was putting my feelings aside to be there for all of them. And when I did lose him, that's when I lost it. I know that in my previous statements, when we were talking about this, is when that phone call came through that somebody had heard from the outside that made it real. And that's when I started to lose it. But thank goodness I did have a job that I needed to be focused, very focused, running a very large dental practice. I could break down in my office. Somebody would walk by and I would just put up my hand. They would know to leave me alone. And now when I go back there, the depth of love that I have for all of them, for being there for me, it's my family. It's my extended family. There were so many people that were there for me and continue to be there for me. Never in my wildest dreams that I think that once I retired, that I would become basically a full-time bereavement coach. And here I am. But because of my experience, I feel that I can give to others what others have given to me. And hopefully they can take that and continue their toolbox of coping and learning. I am a very different person than I was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 13 years ago. But I am learning as time goes on to really enjoy life and embrace it and to love myself again and not live in that pain and that sorrow, but rejoice with the love that I was able to share. So I thank you all for sharing that with us. I think it's important for our audience to hear that, because when you're in the throes of it, you don't see tomorrow. You don't feel tomorrow. You don't believe tomorrow. And it does come. It does come. There are several stages, basically 5 different stages of grief. And not everyone experiences all of them. Some of them to a greater depth than others. And to pass judgment, how do you pass judgment? They're grieving. There is no antidote for it. It's grief. It's individualized. So please remember, whether it's yourself or someone else that's grieving, please give them a pass. Try to be understanding. Try to be compassionate. And the compassion can just be leaving them alone. The compassion can be just giving them a hug. But the point is that you will live. You will cope with your grief. You will learn how to cope with your grief as time goes on. You may not get over it. There will always be that element of loss, but you will survive it. So the basic stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time, each one of us maybe taking one that resonated with us more deeply or did not, and talk about it a little bit. I know that I never went through anger. And the only reason why I didn't go through anger and losing my husband was because we had just had the best weekend of our life. We were on the highest of highs of highs. So I didn't have regrets of not saying something, not doing something, not being there. My only regret is that we didn't have more time. But I loved that we were at the apex of our relationship, because in every relationship, you have ups and downs. I was very fortunate that I didn't have to deal with anger. I've never dealt with the anger. I dealt with denial. As I said, when that phone call came through and somebody said, I heard that your husband had an accident. It was real. It was real. So, Karen, would you like to talk about one of the stages or a couple of the stages of grief that you've gone through and explain your experience with it?
Sure. The first thing was definitely was anger. Because I was young. I thought we were in love just because we got married. And so for him just to look at me and say, this marriage is over and you don't have a voice and, figure out what you want to do. I blamed it all on him, and really did almost up until I went through the recovery method. I was harboring that. It was like, well, of course it's his fault. There was never any denial. I just, but I don't think I went through actual stages. And this is why I say that. I got angry in the beginning. And my mother and father said to me, you never should have married him in the first place. So get on with your life. And I thought that meant I could pack up my stuff and move to Detroit to be with my parents. And no, I was to stay in Cincinnati, where he was from, where all of his family and friends were, and my few friends were. And so with almost a week of us separating, I became single and didn't really want to talk about the marriage or anything. That, I think, was the worst thing that ever happened to me, because I harbored it for years. But to those of you who may do the same thing, if you can get to that point and dig deep, you can recover. You can recover from it.
And a lot of it is being able to talk about it.
Exactly. And luckily, my husband, who I've been with now for 39 years plus, he was the first one I could really talk to about it. We were friends before we became lovers, before we got married. And so I could share everything with him. And through the years, when I started reacting to him as if he were my ex, he would stop me and tell me, look in the mirror, who are you talking to? So we all experience grief differently. I'm blessed. I haven't lost a spouse, but the three of you have taught me quite a bit. And one thing that you just said, Carol, you said you had just come off a great weekend. Well, as I told you before we went on air today, last weekend, my husband basically slept the weekend away. And God forbid if something had happened to him after that, I still think I could have said almost the same thing, that we came off of a good weekend, because he was exhausted. He needed that time. And so that's what I'm learning from all of you. Those are the tools that I'm putting in my toolbox. And I wish I didn't have to learn it this way. I wish instead I had met Ron. I wish I had met Hutch. He sounds like a phenomenal person. Your husband, Allison, I mean, his paintings speak to me. So I feel like I know all three men, but I wish I had met them in real life.
Allison?
For me, it was absolutely not linear. So in different moments at different times, there was more fear, more grief, more anger, more depression, and it hit me off and on across the last almost 7 years. And it's interesting because grief is all of it, includes all of it. But I was having a conversation with one of my clients, and they were describing an experience, and I said, "Oh yeah, that's grief." And he said, "No, it's not, that's anger." And so there are different emotions that men and women are allowed to feel, including when they're grieving. Anger tends to be easier for men to accept. Sadness tends to be easier for women to accept as a generality. So for me, I guess it was sort of owning that it was all of it. And it was all of it randomly and chaotically, and not a clear and simple path forward, but it was like going to Jones Beach and the waves pick you up when you're a small child and they roll you. And I got rolled by all the emotions at one time or another as I've gone through my grief journey.
Yeah.
And that's
Fantastic.
okay.
It is very okay. It's a learning process. It's a growing process. Absolutely. Candace?
I don't know if I felt anything but numbness and then acceptance. So, and the phrase I often use, Allison, and I've been to Jones Beach, but the phrase I often use is I get caught up in the riptide of life. And that's what I felt like. It was ripping me along, pulling me out. And I didn't have the ability in the beginning, the strength at that time to do anything. It wasn't depression. I had enough time with my husband. His death was, we knew it was coming. It was swifter than we expected, but I did have the benefit of being able to have conversations about it. In some ways, I wish I had more presence of mind to have more of those, but he left behind, hundreds of hours of tapes on his ideas about things. He was kind of a philosopher in many ways. So there, just so many things he left behind, but I was in the riptide, and then, it's like a riptide can just pop you out, and then, okay, now I have to deal with life. That's the only way I can explain it.
Yeah. I know. Shock, disbelief, denial.
I don't remember just having the disbelief. It wasn't shock because I knew it was coming. Just not that day. Not denial. It was just, I was just trying to get through every single day. I mean, including before he died, after he died, and then for a period of time afterwards, because there were things at my work that were part of that tsunami of things, to mix my analogies with the riptide, that just caught me up in it. And maybe that was a blessing in a way.
It's how you managed it.
Yeah, and it's how I tended to manage. Looking back, I can see that there might have been more optimal ways to do it, but I didn't feel I had the luxury of the time or cope. That was a phrase my husband used to use all the time. I had run out of cope. Another word for that is resilience, as in Allison's tagline there.
And what did we know? What did we know when we went through this and experienced it? At the time, at least when I was going through it, there really weren't people out there to talk to that had experienced it. Those are the people that I sought out. Those were the people that I was the most comfortable with. And sadly, I had a couple of friends, but in general, they weren't out there 13 years ago. And even finding a therapist who had actually experienced it was very difficult. And a lot of the programs that you have today didn't exist back then. So, and it's still relatively new territory that we're treading here. You know, like I said, I went through shock, disbelief, and denial. I definitely did. The one that we didn't really talk about, though, is the bargaining or the guilt. Did any of you feel that there was guilt or bargaining that you would do that, oh, if I do this, only if I do this, you'll bring him back? Or anyone feel any of the guilt or bargaining? No, I didn't
No.
either. So it's interesting. Of the 5 that are there, the 4 of us skipped one entirely. I'd probably have hit on all the others. Any other things that you'd like to add in your journey in bereavement and where you are today, how you got here, and what it means to you to be able to do this for others? Just being here doing the podcast, what it means to you, being able to give. I know for me, it's extremely cathartic. It brings me a lot of joy in knowing that my pain and my sorrow and the loss of my husband, and I will say it, that may his memory be a blessing. I feel that I'm continuing that. And I thank him every day for giving me the strength to be able to do this and to help others walk through it.
You know, if it hadn't been for that post you had on Facebook, I mean, I've known you a long time, Carol, but then I see this post and those raw emotions that came through on that post. And that's what I knew, that this was a podcast that was so important. And I just didn't want to do it one-on-one. I wanted a panel. I wanted people to see that there's all different forms of grief, that we all get through it differently. And I hesitated before I contacted you to say, hey, what do you think about doing this podcast? Because I didn't want you to think I was preying on everything you had been through. But all of you have made me realize that this is a conversation that we need to have amongst our family members. My mother was so stoic when my father died. And I know for years she kept thinking his end was coming, you know, and then he would fool us all and be back on his feet. But my mother, I never saw her cry. And yet I know my father was the love of her life. So I learned from my mother that you just have to buckle in, just like Candace, you talked about that. Hey, I've got to keep moving forward because that's what people expect of me. So first of all, thank you, Carol, for doing this and helping me
Thank
put this
you.
together.
Thank you for reaching out.
But when I hear your stories, I keep hoping that if I face the same thing for myself, that I will be able to use the tools that you've all talked about.
Remember that one of the tools is knowing that we're all here for you.
Right.
And that's a big tool.
Exactly.
Yes.
And if I
There's
could add to
also-
that, Carol, I'm sorry,
I'm
Alice.
sorry.
I said if I could add to that, not just that we're here, but we're not going to give placebo type of answers, that we've had training and experience and so on. And I think, you know, we've talked about it before, and not to sound complaining, but just, you know, just blameless discerning, that not everybody is artful in that way. And so we have more options, as you were saying, to find the people and resources that can support us in beneficial ways.
And thank you for saying that, because in my next one, the next one that I facilitate, I'd like to talk about the words and the phrases and the sayings and the positives and the negatives of it, and use that as the basis for that podcast. So thank you for bringing that up. And I've already started working on that. One other thing before we run out of time is that there are ongoing triggers or secondhand grief. I'd like to have some of us explain what some of those secondhand moments are that trigger the emotions. And you never know when it's going to happen. You may be walking out the door and it's a beautiful sunny day, and you're enjoying life, and all of a sudden you're just overwhelmed with grief and don't necessarily know why until you take that step back. And it may be, I know for one time for me, it was the anniversary of my grandfather's death, who passed away when I was in grade school. And yet that first anniversary after my husband passed away on my grandfather's birthday is when I had my meltdown. So that was an example of a secondhand grief. And you never know when they're going to overwhelm you. It can be at a wedding. It can be just about anywhere. And I'd like for you to share some of those with us and see if we can explore that a little bit. So I'll go back to Karen once again. You get to be at the top of my screen.
Allison is shaking her head, so I'm going to let her go.
I am.
You can
'cause-
defer to Allison. Allison, please address this.
So I had something that happened fairly recently because we're moving the end of September. And so we don't want to bring anything we don't want to bring. And I had my husband's artist desk with tiny little drawers where all the art supplies, paint from his work on top of it. And on top of that lay some of the bigger paintings. And it took up a lot of space in our apartment. So I decided that I needed to empty it out, take it to a thrift store, and have it go on to somebody else. And when I closed down his studio, I walked this same desk through the streets of New York with paintings lying on top of it. And I would explain, what was going on and all of that. And so I did this kind of Chautauqua and walked it down to the thrift store and handed it over and explained to the guy, who probably could care less, what it was, and cried all the way home. The other thing I did that same week is my accountability partner has a daughter who's 13, who just got into advanced art for next year. And I had all these art supplies, which I'd been keeping because they were close to my heart. And I packed up 38 pounds of art supplies. And then another little library of books, and I shipped them to her. And I wept. So, deep sadness, deep joy at things going on. So there's kind of a balance. So that wasn't a trigger like what you were describing, a song, a place. That was taking an action to let go again. But
in such a beautiful way, Allison, in such a beautiful way.
Yeah, Tess was stuck on an art project, and Camille, my accountability partner, sent me a picture of her lying on the floor with art supplies and the books all around her. And that feels good. And I'm sad. So
yes, but hopefully she'll get inspiration from that too. That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
But that's absolutely a secondary trigger.
Yes.
And it'll be 7 years, September. So, it's taken a long time to get to the point where this was even possible. And that's okay.
It is okay. And it's not that it necessarily gets easier. We just learn to live and cope with it. I'm 13 years into it.
Yep.
So but you learn, you cope, and you learn to live.
Yeah,
Candace?
I think it's so important that it's an ongoing, that there are different places that we go. So if it's 15 years, there's nothing wrong. It's going along.
They are a part of who we are and always will be. Just like your childhood is a part of who you are. And you learned and you grew as a child. Your ups and downs, your falls, your spills. You could have grieved over the loss of a doll or something, or an art project or whatever. That was a form of grief as a child, but it helped build who you became as you got older. And we continue to build. The difference is we're losing loved ones in that grief category too. So not easy, but we're all here working through it. Candace?
I think the thing that tends to catch me is I live across from a lake, and through the trees, I'm high up, through the trees, I can see sailboats. And on Wednesdays, my husband would go sailing, and on the weekends, we'd go down to the boat and stay on the boat over the weekend and go out sailing and so on. So when I catch that first glimpse of white sails on the lake, it catches me up. And then some scents off the lake. So when the wind is blowing towards the house, all of that just reminds me of all of those hours we spent just lolling around on the boat, or silently just sailing for hours. But
And some of those are wonderful memories.
They're all wonderful memories, but it's still, a sense of loss, but not of pain or anything. It's just that void of he's not here. Except
it's the yin and the yang, and that balance that's hard. There's a beauty to it, but there's also a depth of sadness to it.
Yeah, and I do embrace the fact that I have all of those memories. It, was the happiest 23 years of my life.
Yeah. So thankful for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard at that moment in time because you're so in the throes of the pain to know that as time goes on, some of that will help sustain you, those wonderful memories.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to close with another quote. The reality is that you will grieve forever. You will not get over the loss of a loved one. You will learn to live and cope with it. You will heal, and you will rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same, nor should you be the same, nor would you want to. And that's from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And I thought that was pretty poignant, is that we aren't who we were. We are who we are today. Don't know who we're going to be tomorrow. But I'm so thankful for all that we have. Thank you all. Anyone have something that they'd like to say in conclusion? And Allison, don't ever worry. I'm the worst at interrupting and talking over others. So please, this is an open discussion as far as I'm concerned. And don't raise your hand, just jump right in.
I just want to say,
thank you. I appreciate that.
I just want to
love you guys. I truly love you guys.
I want to add that when my youngest son was diagnosed on the autism spectrum, I tried becoming friends with one of his classmates' mothers, and the classmate also was on the spectrum. And it took her a while to agree to go meet me for coffee. And we were at a local coffee shop here in the area, and we're sitting there, and she said, Karen, I just want you to know, you're not the person I would have chose to be my friend. And just because our boys are on the spectrum doesn't mean we have to be friends. I want people to understand that based on what we are feeling, what our emotions are, we're drawn to other people that have experienced those emotions, that have been in that place, because we need to learn from them, because we don't know how to navigate. And I am so grateful to be part of your lives in your journey, because we all have to come together. And when I see this woman still in the area, I always make a big deal of saying hello to her. We could have been nice friends. I didn't have to be her best buddy, but it would have been nice to be able to have a cup of coffee once in a while. So when I get to New York, Allison, we'll go have coffee. Okay. And occasionally I do meet Candace locally. And Carol, we're going to meet somewhere in between here real soon. So I want to thank you all. And
Maybe we'll one day have a podcast where we're all together.
that would be terrific. I think
Yeah,
we should do
We
that.
can have an outing.
I love it.
Plan.
Well,
Let's plan it. Let's make it
okay.
happen. Let's plan it. Let's do it on our anniversary next year.
When is that, by the way?
That would be October.
Okay.
Yeah, our first show is in October. So,
Well, I have a
Just in-
nephew having a wedding then, so
oh,
I'll have to call it in.
How about give or take a month or two? It doesn't have
yeah,
to be exact.
doesn't have to be on the exact day. Well, everybody have a great day. And we want Christy to know we did miss her, but I'm so glad she's having a good time. So
We'll make her way in next time.
we will. Take care,
Take care, all.
everybody. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.